Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled "The World is Watching Democracy and Human Rights in Brazil's 2022 Elections." My name is Sidney Chalhoub. I'm professor of history and African and Afro-American studies here at Harvard. So I'll introduce the event before handing the baton over to our moderator, Natalia Viana, current Nieman Fellow here at Harvard, and co-founder and co-director of Agência Pública, Brazil's first nonprofit investigative news agency. Thank you, Natalia and Agência Pública, for co-sponsoring this important discussion. And also, I should also notice that this is the first of two events. There's another one coming up on April 13th called The Battle Against Fake News in Brazil's 2022 election. So the two events are co-sponsored between DRCLAS and Agência Pública. Today's event will be held in English with simultaneous translation to Portuguese. Please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen to access the Portuguese channel. Para o nosso público no Brasil, cliquem no botão de interpretação na parte inferior de sua tela para acessar o canal de tradução simultânea para o português. I am pleased and honored to introduce today's speakers in the order in which they will present. Though we are initially counting with the participation of the Julissa Mantilla Falcón, President of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the Organization of American States, she unfortunately will not be able to stay with us due to a last-minute change in her schedule. Actually, she is in the middle of a court session, and she is here with us for 1 or 2 minutes to say hello. And I'll give the word immediately to Julissa for her to say hi to us.
I thank you very much. I am very happy to be here. I apologize because I cannot stay. Thank you, Sidney, Natalia, Steve, and Jamil, and of course, Tiago. As you mentioned, I'm in the middle of a hearing of the Inter-American Court, actually in a case against Brazil. But my colleague, Miguel Mesquita, from the team of the commission, he's going to follow with the presentation. Just a little thing that I like to comment, and actually, since I'm in this case, this is a case Sales Pimenta against Brazil. It's a case concerning the case of a defender, human rights defender who was killed, and we are analyzing the impunity of this situation. And I think this is a good introduction to show or to comment on what is one of the main concerns from the Commission concerning Brazil. I'm saying that as a president and also as a rapporteur for Brazil, is the structural discrimination and the problem with the conflict of the property of lands and the impunity in justice. You know, this is a case like we can analyze in a broader context. Actually, the argument of the Commission is this broader context of violence against rural workers. And the case Sales Pimenta is a case of this defender who was killed after he obtained something very historical, like he's stopping the eviction on 150 workers from the land. So what the Commission is analyzing is that first, as I say, the impunity, but also the message that impunity sent to all the people, and in the case of Brazil and workers, it's a double message. First of all, to the victims and their families and other defenders that their life doesn't matter. And the second is that the perpetrators can do that again because nothing is going to happen to them. So in this context, the human rights situation in the case of Brazil, the structural discrimination, impunity, and our concern and our work is to highlight the situation. That's why this event for us is very, very important. I cannot stay longer, but I'm sure that Miguel is going to do perfectly. Thank you very much. And I think there will be other opportunities to share with you. Thank you very much.
Julissa, thank you for coming. Thank you.
Okay. See you. Bye.
So, she'll be substituted by Miguel Mesquita, who is with us, Human Rights Officer, Coordinator at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where he is responsible for the monitoring of LGBTI women, Afro-descendants, persons with disabilities, and indigenous peoples' human rights. Next, we'll hear from our very own Steve Levitsky, David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard, as well as Director of DRCLAS. His research focuses on democratization, authoritarianism, and political parties, and weak and informal institutions. We're also joined by Jamil Chade, a journalist who specializes in international coverage and who has reported on more than 70 countries. From his office at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, Jamil has contributed to international news outlets such as The Guardian, El País, BBC, CNN, and Le Temps, to name a few. We will record today's webinar and publish in the DRCLAS YouTube channel in the coming weeks. We'll also email a link of the recording to all who registered. We hope to see you at some of our other events. In the chat, we've added links to our online calendar as well as social media channels. I encourage you all to follow us there for the most up-to-date information on upcoming events. We'd love to hear from you today. If you have a question for our speakers, please send it through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session, but feel free to submit them at any time. So without any further ado, I'd like to begin by welcoming our first speaker, Miguel Mesquita. Miguel, please.
Thank you so much, Sidney. Thank you so much all. It is a pleasure to take part in this event on behalf of the President of the Commission. Also, thank you so much by the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard for inviting us. It is a really great pleasure to be here. I'm gonna introduce very briefly what I'm going to expose in this point. I think we have in the Commission been aware of the situation of Brazil. We have been following up the whole situation that is being developed in the country in depth since our visit in 2018, in the end of 2018. After that, we established a room for opportunity response for the situations that have been happening in Brazil. And we have been following some specific themes, as the President has already mentioned. The first one is challenges related to democracy and rule of law. This is a broader theme for the Commission. We always keep a close eye on this, mainly because without rule of law and democracy, there is no human rights. So we'll always keep attention on this. The second one is the one that the President already referred to, which is connected to discrimination, mainly human rights, but in Brazil, mainly connected to racial discrimination, gender rights, violence caused by institutions, state institutions, systems of deprivation of liberty, or any other kind of institution that the person is under the supervision of the state, the security situation, the citizen security, impunity against institutional crimes, and the denials from the crimes committed in the times of dictatorship in Brazil. And one of the last points is that I would like to mention is the situation of human rights defenders. In the Commission, and for the Commission, since 1988, Brazil has made enormous progress in consolidating its democracy and guaranteeing the respect for the rule of law. At international level, we would like to mention that the state has signed and ratified many regional and universal human rights treaties, which helped modernize its domestic legislation. Those changes promoted reforms in the executive branch, in many institutions, as well as in the judiciary, aimed to promote human rights, etc. The Commission notes, however, that these changes in many cases have been serving as an examples for countries in the region and around the world. And we really hope that the country can support these changes, because this creates an international environment of not only good practice, but also to help other countries that have challenges in the same issues. In these last years, however, the Commission noticed the coexistence of challenges between different branches of the government, right? In particular, challenges connected to and questioning the independence of the judicial system. That was reflected in the attacks against this branch and the paramount process of check and balances. This for the Commission is really, really important. The independence of the branches and the maintenance of the check and balances system. In addition, the Commission noted that this commissioning of institutions and public policies built over more than 2 decades focused on the defense of human rights, those including the cut of funding and the extinction of spaces aimed at enhancing civil society participation and accountability, such as councils, committees, and commissions. This was a problem that the Commission had already identified in 2018 during its country visit, and we have received substantial information on this issue, and not only from civil society, but also for members of the press. Similarly, we were informed about the criminalization of protests using the anti-terrorism law in Brazil, as well as the increasing violence against journalists and communicators, especially women, at that time, specifically during the elections of 2018. Connected to these last points, during 2020 and 21, the Commission received abundant information on the use of the national security law, which dates from the time of the military dictatorship, as an attempt to intimidate human rights defenders. We know that the law was revoked in 2021, but also is being used by the judicial system to monitor and trying to counter-attempt attacks against democratic institutions, such as the rule of law, independence in Brazil, and the dissemination of false information, also known as fake news. On this issue, the Commission noted the concern the issuing of the provisional measure number 1068 by the executive branch, which established a series of regulations for internet companies, making very difficult for them to act against the spread of fake news on their platforms. And I think this is an important point for the election now in 2022. But going to the human rights situation more focused in Brazil, despite any electoral outcome in the next general election, the Commission stresses that the new elected representatives will have to tackle many structural challenges regarding human rights. These challenges we stated in our country report, and which is interesting because it's a report that it's not old at all. Although being launched in 2021 regarding the visits in 2018, it's a report that shows and put a spot on structural challenges of the country. The first one, for sure, is the question of racial discrimination. In this regard, the Commission was really clear in its report to state that Indigenous people, Afro-descendants, and Quilombolas communities, rural workers, as well as people living in poverty, extreme poverty, or experiencing homeless, women, and LGBT persons continue to be under extreme vulnerability and acts of violence, such as we could see in the case of Fazenda Brasil Verde versus Brazil. This violence is perpetrated by groups, by private persons, but also by people from public institutions, aka police forces and security forces. And we noticed that also has a kind of acquiescence of the state in this process, with impunity, as the president was mentioning. The exclusion generated by the discrimination affects the lives of the lives of indigenous peoples in Quilombola communities, who to this day still are denied access to their ancestral territories, as guaranteed by the Brazilian Constitution. These last years, the Commission noted the disarticulation to territorial policies, as well as impacts of development projects in these places, implemented without prior free and informed consultation with the affected communities. Projects which have increased the historical agrarian conflict and threatens the survival of peoples such as the Yanomami, Mundurucus, and many others. In 2021, we have expressed our concern regarding advances of regulatory projects that could represent a serious setback in the rights of indigenous people and tribal communities, especially those aiming to authorize the President of the Republic to denounce the Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization, projects relaxing and extinguishing environmental requirements for agricultural and energy undertakings in the protected lands, projects liberalizing mining, hydrocarbon activities, and the use of water resources located in the indigenous territories, and amendments to the Constitution to restrict the settlement of indigenous people, and also the regularization of illegally occupied public lands destined to ancestral settlements. In addition, the Commission reiterates its concern in regards to the development and application of the juridical thesis known as temporal framework by the Supreme Court, which could represent, as again, a huge setback on the rights of indigenous peoples and their collective property. Despite important legislative advances approved in the last years in Brazil, such as the Maria da Penha law, as a result of a friendly settlement in the Commission, in the framework of the mandate of the Commission, the crimes of feminicide, the deaths, and the number of assaults suffered by women continue to be extremely high, placing the country in the sad prominent position in the regional scenario. This while patriarchalism and misogyny continue to relegate women to a secondary position in the economy and public affairs, with market wage differences in the labor market and in the representation in parliaments and other public institutions. Moreover, Brazil continues to register extremely high rates of violence against LGBT persons, putting the country literally in one of the sadly ranking of one of the biggest killers of LGBT people in the world. And this whole situation connected to gender also has been used during the election processes as a rhetoric to polarize more the society. We have been noticing this. For example, the law's proposal connected to ideologies or gender ideologies that has been used in this have been used in these last years. I also would like to mention that the Inter-American Commission observed that the penitentiary system, the socio-economical system, socio-educational system, and the therapeutic communities are not able to guarantee protection to its population, mostly composed by Afro-descendant persons. In all cases, torture and ill treatment have been recorded in violation of the inter-American and international human rights standards. The Commission noted that those institutions are commonly used as places to punish people based on their race and socioeconomic situation. With respect to citizen security, the situation is not different. The Inter-American Commission observes that the country has had great difficulty in ensuring the right to live a life free of violence for a broad sector of its population. In this regard, it was noted that Afro-descendant persons once more are the most affected by the war against the drugs, especially young men from socioeconomically vulnerable family backgrounds. These people are most common victims of episodes of intentional lethal violence that mostly are taking place in the context of operation carried by state forces, repeating over and over again situations as we have seen in the case Favela Nova Brasília versus Brazil. Lately, the Inter-American Commission has condemned the police operations in Jacarezinho favela in the state of Rio de Janeiro in May 2021, which left 28 civilians dead, and in the Salgueiro favela in the same state in November 2021, which resulted in at least 9 persons dead. Most of the victims were Afro-descendant persons, numbers that match with the available public statistics that indicated that during last year, at least 78.9% of the victims of police lethality were people from this racial ethnicity. And this whole combination of security plus discrimination, racial discrimination, is also seen in the reliance of the systematic impunity for its perpetrators. The Inter-American Commission reaffirms the persistence of the impunity for crimes committed by public security agents. The challenge, which is structural, systemic, and widespread throughout the country. This can be illustrated not only by the case of Favela Nova Brasília, which was committed more than 20 and 25 or 30 years ago, but also by the Corumbiara massacre and the cases of the murders of May 2016 in São Paulo. In the opinion of the Commission, these characters could indicate the existence of a structured system of violence and execution of unwanted people by the security forces in the Brazilian society, which is also protected by the judicial system. And this also connects to the moment of impunity of the past of Brazil. The Commission notes that the cases of torture and disappearance committed during the period of the civic military dictatorship, such as the case of Vladimir Herzog versus Brazil, remain unpunished. Despite the timid advances in reparation, there is still no information on prosecutions and punishment of identified perpetrators. Additionally, the Commission has been noticing the attempt to negate these crimes. In this concern, we observed that in 2021, the Ministry of Defense published a note extolling the amnesty law as a pact for pacification of the country. Also, demonstration of authorities indicating that celebrating the coup and celebrating military that perpetrated torture. I would like to just finish this exposition saying that for the last 23 years, as the president said, we also have been pointing out the extreme vulnerability situation that human rights defenders have been under in Brazil. This can be, as the president said, seen in the case that is being now under hearing in the court, in the Inter-American Court of Gabriel Salles Pimenta, which was murdered in Pará in 1982, and still no justice for this case. One last thing, just to finish, is that this violence also reflects in the cases now against human rights defenders and also state elected officers. The persecution suffered by the former deputy Jean Willis and the assassination of the former Rio de Janeiro councillor Marielle Franco highlight the state's failure to guarantee the life and safety of those who are dedicated to represent people exposed to extreme vulnerability in the country. And in the same vein, the Commission has expressed its concern about the context of violence suffered by trans, travestite, and intersex counselors in many of the Brazilian states in these last years, while they were working to represent in the parliament. In the conclusion, the Commission highlights that the discussion regarding the Brazilian elections and democracy must take into consideration the many structural human rights challenges faced by the country, as stated in our report 2021. Notwithstanding the difficulties that the Commission the Commission remains committed with enhancing democracy and its institutions, rule of law, and therefore human rights in Brazil. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miguel Mesquita. So, Steve Levitsky, please.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Sidney, and to Natalia for organizing this great event and for inviting me to it. It's really an honor to share the stage, even if it's virtual, with Miguel, with Natalia, and with Jamil. I was asked to talk about, so shifting a little bit, I was asked to talk about what's at stake for democracy, and that should be pretty clear. Anytime that you elect an autocrat to the presidency in a presidential democracy like Brazil or the United States, democracy is at stake, is at risk. And we learned that lesson very clearly here in the United States. The United States has some of the strongest democratic institutions in the world. But in 2016, we elected a president who was not committed to democratic rules of the game, a man who had condoned violence, and who had said even before the 2016 election that he might not accept defeat if he lost. We knew in 2016 that we were electing an autocrat. And in fact, that's what we got. It's not a surprise. It's not rocket science that we got what we got. Donald Trump attempted a presidential coup, what in Latin America we call an autogolpe, in 2020. For the first time in the history of the American Republic, a president refused to accept defeat. For 2 months, Trump tried illegally to overturn the results of the election. When that failed, he incited a violent insurrection on January 6th. Now you might say, well, he failed. American democracy survived. But it barely survived. Trump lost the election in 2020 by a tiny margin. Had he been reelected, US democracy would have been in serious trouble. And even during his relatively short 4-year presidential term, Donald Trump did an extraordinary amount of damage to American democratic institutions. Our electoral process has lost legitimacy and is now being heavily politicized. There is a reasonable chance that the 2024 election will be stolen in the United States. The degree of democratic backsliding that occurred under Trump was stunning. When Donald Trump left office in January 2021, the NGO, the US-based NGO Freedom House, which is traditionally a pretty pro-US institution, ranked the United States as less democratic than Mongolia. It ranked the United States as less democratic than Argentina. Losers of elections accept defeat and leave power peacefully in Argentina. They no longer do so in the United States. Brazilians, unfortunately, repeated our mistake when they elected an openly autocratic figure in 2018. As is the case, any time that you elect an autocrat, Brazilian democracy, therefore, was placed at risk. Now, there's some important similarities and some important differences between the United States and Brazil, and I want to highlight some of these similarities and differences quickly. The parallels in discourse and behavior between Trump and Bolsonaro and their governments are pretty striking. And I guess that's not a coincidence because Bolsonaro appears to have borrowed quite heavily from the Trump or Trumpian playbook. But beyond right-wing populist discourse, there's some other things that are interesting parallels. One important parallel between the two countries is that both Trump and Bolsonaro were extraordinarily inept. Their right-wing populist theatrics were never very popular, never gained the support of a majority of the population. And in particular, the rejection of expertise during a pandemic led to historically disastrous COVID-19 policies, which in turn left them politically weakened. It pains me to say this, but had it not been for COVID and Trump's response to COVID, he probably would have been reelected in 2020. So his incompetence ultimately weakened him a lot. And I think it's pretty clear that Bolsonaro's COVID policies also, they were not the only factor, but they undermined his chances of reelection as well. Not all right-wing populists are so incompetent. This is one thing, one area where Trump and Bolsonaro really stand out. They were strikingly incompetent, and that ultimately weakened them to the benefit of democracy, not to the benefit of their societies, but for the benefit of democracy. Now, that said, I think there's some important differences between the United States and Brazil that are worth drawing attention to. Some of these differences leave Bolsonaro in a weaker position than Trump, and some of these differences leave Bolsonaro potentially in a stronger position than Trump. One key difference is that Trump had a strong political party behind him. He managed to consolidate near total control over one of two major parties in a two-party system. That means that the entire center-right in the United States closed ranks behind him no matter what he did. That protected him from impeachment, and it ensured that almost no matter what he did, he would be electorally viable in elections. He'd be highly competitive in elections. As long as Trump was and is backed by the Republican Party, he cannot be politically isolated, and that's important. Bolsonaro, by contrast, never had a real party, which left him much more isolated than Trump. As all of you know, the entire center-right in Brazil closed ranks behind Bolsonaro tragically in 2018 due to the extraordinary anti-pechismo that existed at the time. Just as an aside, I traveled to Sao Paulo in July 2017. A couple of liberal businessmen brought me down to try to convince their friends in the business community to not support Bolsonaro in the second round that they knew was coming. Obviously, I completely failed. But I learned a lot about just how intense the anti-PT sentiment was in the sort of Sao Paulo Tucano community. People who considered themselves liberals and Democrats. So they closed ranks in 2018. But whereas Trump consolidated control over the entire Republican Party during his presidency, Bolsonaro saw this right-wing coalition blow apart. So whereas the mainstream center-right in the United States was trapped inside Trump's Republican Party, much of the mainstream center-right in Brazil eventually moved into various shades of opposition. I'm talking about the PSDB, Moro and his friends, much of the Paulista business and financial community. And that has left Bolsonaro much more politically isolated than Trump. So that works to his disadvantage. But another difference may favor Bolsonaro. In the United States, Trump, there was no chance that Trump could mobilize the army or the security forces behind his political project. One of the basic lessons of this sort of the autogolpe playbook in Latin America is that presidents can only pull off autogolpes if they have the cooperation of the armed forces. Fujimori in Peru, Bukele in El Salvador, going back further, Vargas in Brazil. Trump could not get the army behind him, which is why the January 6th insurrection was always destined to fail. In Brazil, it's a little less clear. Unlike the United States, Brazil has a long history of military intervention, often against perceived threats from the left. The military, unfortunately, in my view, is one of Brazil's most trusted political institutions. It is much, much more trusted by the public than our political parties, Congress, the courts. And the military has, in fact, as Natalia has shown, crept back into the political arena in recent years. Most notably, at least for me, in 2018, when General V.S. Boas put his thumb on the scale of the judiciary by tweeting that Lula should be in prison. That was an incredibly, incredibly dangerous step back to a world in which the military was a sort of decisive political actor. Now, Bolsonaro obviously actively courted the military. He essentially governed with sectors of the armed forces community. But this is not 1950. It's not 1930. The Brazilian military is far, far more committed to democracy and civilian rule than it was 50 or 70 years ago. And I think the military is unlikely to back a Bolsonaro power grab as long as he remains unpopular and politically isolated. And in fact, the signs so far seem to be that key sectors of the military, dominant sectors of the military, are reluctant, very reluctant to go along with an authoritarian adventure. But it's not certain. It is not certain. Whereas in the United States, it was clear that the military would not step in really under any circumstance to help Trump seize power. In Brazil, I don't think we can be certain. So Bolsonaro creates a crisis. If there's some episode of violence, maybe perpetuated by right-wing militias, we cannot know for sure that the military won't step in, won't weigh in. For that reason in particular, I think there's a need for a very broad pro-democracy coalition in Brazil and in the coming election, far bigger than even that which exists today. Lula, to his credit, has worked very hard to broaden his appeal, to broaden his coalition. He's rebuilt, apparently, bridges to the PSDB, might even have, I don't know if the rumors are true, Alckmin as a vice presidential candidate. That's very important. I don't think it's enough. Bolsonaro has already made it clear, at least in what I've seen, that he's unlikely to accept defeat. And as we've learned in the United States, when a politician makes it clear that he's unlikely to accept defeat, you have to take that seriously. Politicians who refuse to accept defeat will try to create a crisis. They'll try to create a crisis to undermine the credibility of the election, to throw the election up in the air. That is exactly what Trump did on January 6th, and something similar could easily happen in Brazil. Again, if there's especially if there's an episode of violence. The best way to avoid such a crisis, to make sure that that sort of crisis doesn't happen, is to win a massive electoral victory in the first round. A massive, I'm talking about 60 to 40, 63 to 35, an uncontestable victory. As things stand, Lula stands a very good chance of winning the election, but it probably will not be an overwhelming victory. It probably will not be a first round victory. Instead, it will be a polarized second round victory in a race in which the right is again stirring up anti-petismo and trying to create a crisis. That's a scenario fraught with risk. I think a much better strategy would be a unified front in the first round. That means a first round alliance among the PT, center, meaning the PSDB, and parties of the center right. Lula would have to inevitably make some pretty significant concessions in order to build such a broad coalition. The left would have to make some pretty big sacrifices, but that's what it takes. Sacrifice is what it takes to build a broad coalition, and broad coalitions are what it takes to defend democracy. This is another important difference between the United States and Brazil. The United States has a two-party system and no presidential runoff. So the entire opposition unified behind Joe Biden in 2020, easily. Without that total opposition unity, Trump would have won. Brazil does not have total opposition unity, and I worry about that. The stakes are high, not only for Brazil, but they're high across Latin America. As all of you know, these are challenging times for Latin American democracies. Public discontent is soaring. Citizens are angry, often for good reason, at their governments, at their politicians, at their political parties. Public trust in democratic institutions almost everywhere in the region has plummeted, to the point, again, where armies have more public trust than do legislatures and political parties. Politics are intensely polarized in many countries, in part due to the emergence of this new illiberal right of which Bolsonaro is a part. We see this not only in Brazil, we see it in Colombia, in Chile, in Peru, Bolivia, and elsewhere. And crucially, militaries have again begun to flex their muscles. Again, not only in Brazil, but also in Bolivia, in Peru, in El Salvador, in Honduras, elsewhere. So this is a dangerous moment for democracy in Latin America. If Bolsonaro was somehow to manage to undermine Brazilian democracy, he could easily become a model for the right elsewhere in the region. It would not, of course, be the first time. 58 years ago, a Brazilian coup helped to trigger a wave of coups across Latin America, and Brazil's military dictatorship became a model for others in the region. I worry that in some sense, history could repeat itself. I think stepping back, Brazil has a chance to be a model multiracial democracy in the 21st century, expanding the kinds of rights that Miguel was just talking about. But it also has a chance to become a model for authoritarian reaction in the years to come. Brazil is a big and influential country. People are watching. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve. So Jamil Chade, please.
Thank you, Sidney. Thank you, Natalia, for organizing this. Tiago, Miguel, Stephen. I'm actually in Geneva, but I'd like to thank you for this opportunity and for placing basically the Brazilian story in your agenda. My perception is that, as Professor Levitsky mentioned, a lot is at stake, not only for Brazil, but for Latin America and beyond, I would say, especially with brothers of Bolsonaro in Europe, such as Orban and others, as using Bolsonaro's words, obviously. So 2022 will be a decisive year for our young democracy. I'm a journalist, and I just wanted to tell you that last month here at the UN, inside the UN building, at the opening session of the Human Rights Council, the Minister of Human Rights of Brazil came to make her speech, the opening speech, basically. And when it finished, I went to talk to her and try to pose her a question. And her reaction was, "I'll call the security if you ask me a question." This is the human rights minister inside the UN building talking about human rights. This is the situation that we face in reality. In November of last year, at the G20 summit in Rome, my colleagues and I, we were physically attacked by the security services while trying to actually work to ask questions to President Bolsonaro. Despite the videos that circulated, despite the elements that showed that we were attacked, the official narrative was that these attacks had never happened. A couple of days later, the narrative changed. It happened, but actually the journalists attacked first. We attacked the security services. Anyway, I'm just bringing these two examples, very minor examples, but just to show that actually for the last 3 years, journalists in Brazil have become some of the main targets of insults, aggressions, and intimidations by members of the government. Some are blunt, but many others are hidden behind fake accounts. I actually dispute the term virtual attacks. They can be virtually means, but their impact is absolutely real. So I try not to use virtual attacks when talking about attacks on human rights defenders, on journalists, or any other groups that could be in a situation of vulnerability. The National Federation of Journalists registered in Brazil a record number of attacks in 2021 against media professionals, 430 cases in only 1 year. Another study by Reporters Without Borders showed that only in the first half of 2021, 87 verbal attacks were launched by the president himself against the press. 87 attacks in only 6 months. He was actually the main perpetrator of attacks against the press. That's basically an average of 2 per week. If we include the entire family, the Bolsonaro family, we would get to the number of 293 attacks in only 6 months. If we turn to the, let's say, to the web, to the virtual world, the situation is also dire. 1.4 million attacks in 1 year in Brazil, 4,000 per day, 3 per minute. And these are only attacks against the press. some against Natalia and myself, as we well know. And funny enough, here at the UN, Brazil is the co-sponsor of a resolution for the protection of journalists. So obviously, there's a mismatch. Someone is not talking to someone there, now inside the government. But you know, the attacks are not, they're just part of the grand scheme of the instruments. The second layer is basically the denial of access to information, either by ignoring our requests from the press to comment or even to explain public policies, but also by establishing very long periods of secrecy regarding official documents. So that's the second, actually, layer of threat to the press in Brazil at this point. Now, the strategy, and yes, there is a clear strategy, is completed by the establishment of channels of communications in which lies and disinformation can flow with no filters and no questions by any of the journalists. And yet again, a very impressive data showing that if we take lies and distorted statements by President Bolsonaro in 2021, it adds up to 2,500 statements. 2,500 lies or disinformation promoted by himself, which means 7 per day. That is what happened in 2021. So in the last 3 years, but mainly obviously in 2022 with the elections, what is at stake is not only the safety of journalists. Obviously, we are worried with that, about that in terms personally, basically. But that's not the underlying issue. What is at stake is basically the survival of democracy. When citizens are unable to be informed or to gather information about what is done with either the tax money or with the political legitimacy that they gave to a government, we can hardly call this system a democracy. So, and just to conclude, obviously I'm open to any questions, Natalia, regarding the foreign policy issues regarding Brazil, but just to conclude, democracy does not only die in the dark, as a paper in your side of the world states, very well said, by the way, but it also dies every time a virtual or an offline attack is registered. It also dies when access to information is denied. It also dies when the press is labeled as the enemy of the people. It also dies when disinformation becomes a weapon in the power struggle. It also dies when the press becomes a target. So coming back, and what basically what all of this is about, that 2022 will be a decisive year for our generation. And the world needs to know what is at stake, both for Brazil, for the region, and elsewhere. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Jamil. Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you very much for sharing all of your reflections with us. Thank you, especially Miguel and Jamil, for mentioning the situation of journalists and specifically female journalists. I was a victim of doxing and harassment, as was my entire team, which is led by women. So I understand the chilling effect, that intended chilling effect that these attacks may have. And I want to thank Professor Steve. It's always a great learning experience to listen to you, and it's very helpful to draw the parallel between Brazil and the US. Now we have a lot of nice questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask only 2 questions for each one of you, and then I'm going to go to the public. So I want to start with Miguel and Jamil Chade. We decided to call this panel "The World is Watching," and I would like to dig a little bit into that. So how has the perception about Brazil from being a young and solid democracy to a place where democracy is at risk, how has this changed in your specific field? So for Miguel, I'd like to know what has changed within the OAS to report on Brazil in this moment right now. And for Jamil Chade, what has changed in international diplomacy and in the UN and in the UN?
Well, I can step in and start replying to this. I think the great change that we've seen is that from a country that was very much respected internationally on regards of human rights and many human rights policies, we've seen a huge setback and a kind of discoordination of these examples and good practices that other countries could use. And the repetition of some of bad practices that were being reproduced. So for example, this kind of gender ideology situation that it's that spread through the region, and also had a start in Brazil in 2018 with the party without school without parties proposal of law, bill of law. So all of those things, as the professor was saying, Brazil is a gigantic country, and we cannot undermine the ability of these countries, such as the United States as well, to serve as a good influence to other countries in the region. And once we notice that a country is having setbacks on human rights, this raises a red flag for us, and it's like, whoops, something really dangerous can be happening. We have to pay a lot of attention, because we're talking now about indigenous lands being exploited without any consent, about like authorizations that have been happening. We're talking about people being discriminated without any kind of shame, right? Just because their gender, their sexual orientation. And this is okay for people to think. So this kind of social culture is very dangerous, and for us, raise a flag. I will stop by here and pass to Jamil.
Natalia, allow me to tell a very short story on a first meeting on gender issues in 2019 with the Brazilian government, with the new Brazilian government, the current Brazilian government. I was told by a source that Brazil was going to veto in a resolution the term gender equality. It was very surprising to everyone. And before the meeting began, the first meeting where the resolution was going to be negotiated, I went to the presidency of that meeting. It was a Mexican diplomat. And I asked him whether he had heard anything about this, or he had, if he was worried about this situation. And he looked at me basically saying, poor journalist, he must be nuts. This is an agreed term for the last 30 years. There's nothing being, at the moment, coming to question gender equality. Well, I sat back, obviously went back to my place thinking, my source got it wrong. Well, let's wait for the meeting to happen. And as soon as the meeting began, it was quite incredible that Brazil was raising their flag. The delegation was raising the flag, asking every time the term gender equality appeared to be substituted for equality between men and women. And at the third time that happened, the president, sitting on his post, looked at me with a very astonished face, and everyone in the room, and I can remember that, asking themselves, what is happening here? So from a situation of a protagonist in the expansion of rights, Brazil became an actor in the limitation, in the shrinking, basically, of any debate of what rights should be. It is part of a dismantling strategy of the system that prevailed for the last 70 years, I would say. This is Brazil at the UN today. This is Brazil at the Human Rights Council. When someone says, well, then why did they get re-elected, or why did they want to get re-elected? Why are they so interested in staying in these organs? Well, precisely for having the role of dismantling, for breaking the consensus that happened for so many years. And this has become, and just to complete, Natalia, this has become actually a very big source of preoccupation. especially on this element that both of you, Miguel and Stephen, just mentioned, the impact that Brazil can have, the imitation. For many years, I remember how other delegations would wait for Brazil's speech at the WTO, at the WHO, at the UN, for them to take the floor. Basically, let's hear what Brazil has to say and then taking the floor. So this again happens in a very strong way. And just to complete this, this answer, Natalia, when Professor Levitsky mentioned January 2021, the end of the Trump government, the last day of Trump's government, someone that was working with President Trump, Valerie Huber, she was the equivalent of this, I would say, Secretary of Family, of Women and Family for the Trump administration. She sent an email on her last day in office. And what she said was very striking. She sent an email to NGOs, obviously ultra-conservative NGOs, and to partners saying, it was a pleasure to work with President Trump. It was the best moment of my life, my career. Our agenda has to continue. And for that, I'll ask all of you to reach out to the Brazilian embassy in Washington. So this was an email that actually circulated, I have a copy, that actually basically giving the baton to the next group in line. So this is actually the role that Brazil plays today in the human rights system, basically to dismantle, to break consensus, and obviously, eventually, in a second term, to start building something else. Up to us in Brazil not to allow that to happen as well. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you very much, Jamil. I want to ask specifically about elections. I do think that the professor has already stated very clearly, but if he wants to comment as well, this question is for all of you. I wanted to state, what do you think is the gravest threat to the 2022 elections, and how different sectors of Brazilian society can prepare? I mean, there's not a lot of time, but I'm sure a lot of people here are thinking, what can we do to prevent a scenario that is, you know, like the US or worse?
Can I say something very briefly? I think again, there are some interesting parallels to the United States. Heading into the 2020 election in the United States, it was pretty clear that Biden was going to win. It ended up being closer than the polls suggested, but it was very, very likely Biden was going to win. So it was very likely that Trump was going to reject the results and try to create a crisis. And activists on the left spent weeks and months preparing for this event and preparing for some sort of possible outcome, which would have to involve violence. It would have to involve creating a situation in which Trump could plausibly say that Antifa or left-wing militants were breaking the law and stealing the election, and then he could maybe declare an emergency. I mean, all that was fairly far-fetched, but you know, we saw what happened. There was a violent incident. And so what the left did, what activists did in the weeks prior to the election was engage in a dramatic effort of collective self-discipline, making sure that even the smallest group that was somehow, it was anti-Trump, would not take to the streets and be provoked by right-wing militias and right-wing thugs. And I know I wasn't only vaguely aware of this stuff at the time, but I've talked to people who work behind the scenes since the election, and they were working every day to make sure that not a single person, not a single progressive activist was provoked. And they did it. They were perfect. And that's one reason why they could not possibly blame that, you know, say that there were two sides fighting or that the left was violent. Only the right was violent. Only the right was violent on January 6th. And that was critical. I think Brazil has I should be quick here. Brazil is in a vaguely similar situation in that the way things are going now, Bolsonaro should lose. Bolsonaro is going to have to do something dramatic to remain in power. So the advantage in an important sense belongs to the democratic opposition. But it's one key part of this, of surviving this, of whatever Bolsonaro throws at Democrats, and he will throw something at them. We know that, that they're not provoked. And that there's no way that Bolsonaro can even invent left-wing violence on election day or around the election. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. Jamil, Miguel, who wants to complement?
Can I jump in very briefly? I agree with Professor Levitsky, but I would add another layer, which worries me personally, is the fact that yes, activists and yes, political parties are aware of this scenario, but I'm very worried that it is still not I would say it's not widespread, the sense that there is a threat in terms of society. I still think that we're being, not we, but at least the country is being too ingênuo, if I can say it in Portuguese, very much believing that the system will work and believing and trusting that this will not happen. I think we should, in a way, make it clear that this can be a scenario, that this can happen, and that people need to get ready for this. The denial of the threat is my personal preoccupation. Obviously, if Miguel wants to send a monitoring team, that would be very much welcome.
Thank you, Jamil. Well, I will jump in this because I think it was a provocation. We're not electoral. The OAS has its own electorate team and experts, etc. We take a picture of the situation of human rights, and that's the idea, right? We can see how the countries are complying or not with this. But replying to this kind of I would say naive provocation, just the idea is, I think it's very important to and taking this that the professor said and Jamil also said is the situation of ingenuity, right? This naiveness of the population of not believing that something could come. I think it also relies in the idea that in these last 20, 30 years, Brazil has been rebuilding its democratic institutions. It has been been very, very good on going through the process of institutional challenges, of the balance and the check and balance systems. And for example, as a good example of this is the attacks that Supreme Court has been receiving these last years, right? It will not be receiving if it was not be responding. So the institutions actually are responding to this kind of new situation that is being presented, as the professor and Jamil mentioned. But I think I would add something that it's really concerning for everyone, and we have been seen as a team that monitors the whole South America, is the kind of polarization that the professor mentioned in all societies. It's a huge process of polarization. And it seems that in these last years, international examples open the door to extremes, actually. Or is one extreme, we don't have any kind of polarization more in the center of things. We have polarizations literally in the extremes. And this could, as the professor mentioned, ignite a kind of situation that happened in the United States. That's why I think it's really interesting what the professor mentioned to people, train this kind of peace and trust in the institutions. But at the same time, as Jamil said, for sure, the institutions are also being threatened. And this can happen at any time, right? That's what the history tells us, that it's not a linear line that goes throughout progress, but actually progress turns to repeat itself in the same mistakes that some actions in the past happened. So in this sense, I think what it's really important is the role of the media also in this process. And calling back Jamil on this, because the spread of fake news, the spread of misinformation, those are situations that can actually change elections. We've seen this, right? And how this situation also can preserve institutions that are connected to the check and balance and be able to protect them to do their job and keep the trust of the society in these institutions. So maybe, Jamil, you have to be with your team to be to program like a very good accountability of the elections and protect institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Love the interchange there. I think we are all responsible, of course. That's why we're here. We're thinking what to do, right? I've got three questions about the elections themselves that are very interesting. And the first one, I like it a lot. It's from Marina Costa. I like it a lot because it's about like the broader sense of democracy, not just presidential elections. And it's what could be done or what should be done to protect vulnerable candidates such as women, indigenous, and LGBTQA+, considering that they are more vulnerable, and there is a lot of cases of these kinds of candidates seeking police protection for the next elections. And I'm going to just open it for which one of you wants to answer.
Well, I need to be committed, but I love to speak. So, no, I'm joking. I think like a very good example to protect these people is, first of all, the recognizing that they are endangered. I think like recognizing that these people are in the situation of extreme vulnerability. I think what happened to Marielle was a situation that raised the flags against this kind of violence that Brazil didn't see since like probably the 90s, right? Of probably saw, but was really, has been seen, but was really undercovered by other things and situations. So the first thing is literally exposing the threats that these people are suffering in order to protect them. And in order to call state authorities to be able to respond, or not to be able to respond, actually, right, to these threats. Another thing is the more these candidates go and win, the more they will suffer a setback against them, because this is a process of, as a former commissioner used to say, it's a process of shadows and lights. Every time that there is shadows, there is also the lights too, or there is lights, there is also shadows. And if there is threats, it's because these people are gaining more space in the society, in the discourse, in the public questioning. And one thing that I think is quite interesting to work and to be aware is the youth, the younger people, the younger voters, like we have to pay attention to their participation as well in this process, on how they communicate, how they are changing mentalities, changing the social culture to be more aware and to spread more the culture of rights, of respect, of non-discrimination, of equality for these people. So I think it's a two process, right? A protection by the authorities by showing the situation, but at the same time using this youth that the youth, that it's like being much more open to this diversity and inclusion.
Thank you very much.
I can say something very broadly. I'm not anywhere near expert to say anything intelligent about protecting vulnerable candidates in Brazil, though it's incredibly important. But just very broadly, this, and I agree entirely with Miguel, this is the challenge of multiracial democracy. In a truly democratic regime, we would not ask this question. We would not have to worry about vulnerable candidates. In a truly multiracial democracy, individuals from every group have equal protection under the state. The fact that there are vulnerable candidates, first of all, the fact that there are candidates from vulnerable minorities means that Brazil is continuing this decades-long movement towards multiracial democracy, which is an extraordinary achievement. The fact that they are threatened shows us how far we have to go.
Thank you very much. Professor, hold to the microphone because the next two questions are for you. The first one is, you mentioned that Lula's effort to consolidate, a bridge between, with PSDB and other parties. But Lula is not part of what the Brazilian mainstream media is calling the third way. And the question is, do you believe there is still time to build a coalition that would be the third way, center name? And how useful is this kind of craving that is being, talked about a lot, but there's no real candidate behind?
I do not think there is time for a third way. I think the third way has to get is Lula. This is not my own personal preference. This is a read of Brazilian polls over the last 9 months. Lula is going to be, barring some kind of extraordinary event, Lula is going to be in the second round against Bolsonaro. The so-called third way candidates are at 4, 5, 6, or 7% in the polls consistently over 9 months. That's 20% of Lula's standing in the polls. I think we have to, as we say in Spanish, you have to, es lo que hay. This is what exists. It's not, the broad coalition is going to have to be built around the candidacy of Lula, which means Lula's going to have to make concessions to the center right. A broad coalition requires concessions on both sides, but the first step is recognizing that overwhelmingly Lula is the most viable candidate to challenge Bolsonaro. Again, this is simply what the polls say.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is by Stanley Gasek. I'm going to get the second part, which is super interesting. I'm going to ask Jamil and Miguel if they want to jump in as well. Question is the following. Do you see any danger in Bolsonaro and his campaign to attempting to tamper with the integrity of the Brazilian electronic voting system? And also something that's being speculated very silently, that considering that he has met the Russian president, Putin, a little bit before the invasion of Ukraine, and the Russians are expert in cyber warfare and interfering with the election processes, and they have done this in the US. Do you think, and also that Brazil has not denounced Putin, Brazil is kind of aligning itself, not openly, but it's being very, very silent in the international arena. Do you think there is any chance that we are seeing a Putin-Bolsonaro coalition that could interfere with the electronic voting systems? And if anybody else wants to comment on this as well.
Natalia, comment on this relationship between Brazil and Russia. Today at the ILO, a resolution was put forward to condemn the aggression by Russia and also to suspend not Russia from ILO, but programs that ILO would have with Russia. Only 8 countries abstained. One of them was Brazil, including Pakistan, Cameroon, and others, and China voted against. So there are 2 layers in this relationship between Brazil and the, let's say, Ukrainian war. The first one is a legitimate one, which is the fear that many of the international organizations will be kidnapped by the discussion of the war. And that at the end of the day, we don't know what it will be the end of this crisis, you will have institutions that will be weakened in a way. I'm not defending this argument. I'm saying that this is the structural, systemic argument that Itamaraty has. But there's a second element, which is obviously the relationship between Bolsonaro and Putin. Let us remember that the trip of Bolsonaro to Moscow only happened when he felt that he had no other, let's say, partner to visit. He tried Biden, he tried Boris Johnson, he didn't try Macron for obvious reasons, and neither or others. And there was this opportunity with Putin and Orban later on. So there is also, I would say, an electoral element to this story, undoubtedly. There's no doubt that there is a chapter, a layer on the story that deals with the election. Whether it will be a cooperation in terms of hacking, I'm not sure. I cannot come to this conclusion. What is real is the fact that there is a relationship that goes straight to the election. We have to remember Carlos Bolsonaro was also at the trip to Moscow. No one knows precisely for what reason. So all of this is still a question for us journalists to go after some of this information. But the truth is that you have an obviously worrying trend of I would say, a good relationship, a working relationship at least, between the Brazilian government and the Russian government. It's not by coincidence that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, put Brazil as one of the countries that would not dance to the music. The question is, all of these votings here at ILO, last week at UNESCO, the attempt of Brazil not to allow the G20 to expel Russia, this will have a price. Russia will pay back somehow, either by exporting fertilizers or exporting technology.
Could I say a couple of things about that? So first of all, anytime you have an authoritarian president, anytime you have a president not committed to democratic rules of the game, not committed to accepting defeat, you have to worry. So there's good reason to worry and be concerned. Exactly how Bolsonaro will try to undermine the election is hard to say. We don't know, but we absolutely have to be concerned. And I share Jamil's concern, because we had it here in the United States that the public is not sufficiently worried. That said, a couple of things. First of all, Brazil has a much less vulnerable electoral system than the United States. The United States is the world's leader in electoral vulnerability. We have the worst imaginable system, very easy to politicize, very easy to corrupt. Brazil's is, thank God, much better. So it's not going to be so easy to politicize, which is why Bolsonaro tried to change the electoral system several months ago. In terms of Russian intervention, a couple of things. First of all, Russia is likely to be otherwise occupied in a way that it might not have been had it not chosen this war with Ukraine. So stealing the Brazilian election is not going to be at the top of Vladimir Putin's to-do list in October 2022. I can guarantee you that. Secondly, it's really hard. It's really hard to change, for a foreign power to change the results of a national election. The United States has tried it many times, and you know what? Most of the time, it's failed. Foreign hacking is possible, obviously, but it's only possible in really close elections that whose outcome is indeterminate. If things go as they are, and particularly if Lula does build a broad coalition, and they manage that 60-40 victory that that I would like to see in the first round. There's no way that you can hack a 60-40 result. Brazilians are not stupid, right? If Lula's going into the election with a 20-point lead and he loses, that's not going to be viable. So the key is avoiding a close election.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Two questions more. I think we have time. First one is by Ivan Ferraz, and it's to the three of you. What are the chances that an autocratic president such as Bolsonaro be judged and convicted by the international courts for disrespecting human rights and specifically against the indigenous people? But I think his question is about all of them. I mean, we have a new wave of autocrats. Is there any chance that they will end up in whatever time it takes in the international courts, International Criminal Court?
So I can try to respond on this question. I think the response is it's a very difficult question to respond indeed, right? We have many few people that were actually convicted in these courts. I think just some, not count more than 10 probably, African dictators in the past, and also some European Eastern former dictators as well. So those are processes that take a lot of time, and it's very difficult to kind of. But the point is, one thing that the international system does, it's not only about it doesn't work as in a national system, a judicial national system, right? I think the great power that any kind of international system has is the possibility to spread the power of shame of what's happening, to bring light to something to the international community that could be used after to avoid any kind of commercial possibilities that could be, you know, so. And we have like examples, for example, many countries, many European countries, Canada, I think also, they include now a human rights clause in their connections, in their like agreements between countries. Once they are gonna borrow money or they are gonna engage in an international cooperation. And this kind of situation, this kind of broad situation of power of shaming brings the possibility to stall this kind of cooperation and try to stop somehow the violation, right? And another thing that I think it's quite important is we should also look not only for the people, the public representatives, but also companies. And I think like companies more and more business and human rights have been very responsible on choosing the public judgment, right? Because they are going to be judged as well. And engaging in this kind of operations, engaging is also very damaging for their image. So this also can be used to this process to counter all the situation of setbacks within country.
Thank you very much. So we do not have a lot of time. We've got about 6 minutes. Sorry, somebody else wants to comment. Sorry, Jamil.
Very quickly. I agree with Miguel. Just to make one thing very clear, we should not wait for these international courts, but the process of presenting evidences to these courts, the process of, as Miguel said, shaming, or the process of questioning, and the process, above all, of alerting the world of what is happening in the country is also part of the construction of democracy and human rights. So it is not only the end game in the sense of a trial, a condemnation, an arrest. That is not, let's say, the only target. Obviously, as a victim, you will want that to happen for sure. But as a construction of a nation, as a construction of democracy, we have to go beyond looking for the let's say, the person that is guilty or not, and building a system that can shed light on all of this. So the process is as important, or I wouldn't say as important, but at least it has a very big weight in this process of construction of democracy.
Thank you, Jamil. It's so nice to listen to all of you and to see how committed and interested you are to the future of Brazil. And I have a last question, and I'm going to ask you to speak up to 2 minutes and do your closing remarks already, because we're running out of time. Last question is looking at the future, and it's by Giulia Affiuni. The question is to all of you. Even if Bolsonaro loses his re-election bid, what will it take to restore the damages that he has done to Brazil and to weaken Bolsonarismo, the social force that is behind him? And if we have any example in history that we could look at to learn how to, get over this. Let's do in the same order, so Miguel could be first.
Well, thank you. I think we have to look at a more a situation that Brazil has been presenting these last years, right? Brazil has been increasing the amount of rainforest and Amazon forests being taken, or the environmental damage is really high. Brazil has been in these last years, the poverty and extreme poverty in Brazil also have increased. We have been noticing that some policies regarding security, for example, the disarmament policies that were taken since the 90s were reverted. So we have a wide distribution of weapons against the society. And as we can see in history, those are changes that take a lot of time. The damage can be done in small amount of time, but to re-engage in processes that dismantle this kind of damage is it takes a lot. And sometimes take more than one mandate could take. That's the real problem, I think, for all representatives that were being elected in these last years, is like poverty, discrimination, etc. They were used to, they increased the inequality between the very rich and the poor increased, right? And to tackle these issues, structural issues, it is a process of planning policies, of taking into consideration, of correcting courses, and this can take more than the time that people have to have in their patience to wait. So maybe, and to finish as well, is like the possibility to think that changes, structural changes take time, but they need to be started to get started. So I cannot give like a time how much will take, but, and in regards to polarization, I think the point is create channels, create places of debate. This is a great question. I think this is $1 million question. I will leave to the professor to reply, but the situation about polarization is something that we have been seeing in the whole region and maybe in the whole world, and how it goes in the core of democracy, of democracies, which is the mistrust of the constituents in their representatives. There is a problem of, I don't see myself reflected on who I elect. And maybe the whole society needs to start a process of rethinking this, right? Of to make like progresses towards a situation that you can at least sit on a table to debate. Because what we're seeing in many other societies of the continent is that there is not even a possibility to interchange opinion anymore. Thank you.
Professor.
So Miguel, if I knew how to reduce polarization, I would have a much better paying job than I have right now. So this question that was posed to us is a really, really important one. And I'm glad that you ended with it. I think we see in the United States the dangers that are posed. Getting rid of the autocrat is only one step in preserving and saving democracy. And the difficulties that the Biden administration has had show us how easy it is to fail. There is a very good chance that an authoritarian-leaning Republican Party wins the next 2 elections in the United States. So the dangers that of not consolidating this victory, the dangers of not thinking about what gets done, thinking about the work after removing Bolsonaro are very, very real. This is a great question. I mostly agree with Miguel. I don't want to repeat him. Lula, whatever government comes after Bolsonaro, must begin to restore public trust in democratic institutions. Must do that. If they don't do that, we'll have another Bolsonaro. It may not be exactly. It might not be someone named Bolsonaro, but it'll be another populist who threatens basic rights and basic institutions. So how do you do that? How do you restore public trust? Obviously, restoring economic growth helps. Making democracy more meaningful to people, which is something that the PT governments had begun to do and had cared a lot about historically, but finding ways to make democratic institutions more meaningful to more people, particularly people who are historically excluded from institutions, would matter a lot. But most centrally and at the top of the agenda, I think, has to be combating corruption in a meaningful way. This is an area where the PT frankly failed and blew up a lot of its legitimacy, tragically, because the PT is the most important vehicle in Brazil, maybe in all of South America, for deepening democracy. It may have another chance, but it lost a lot. It lost a lot with the scandals of the second decade of the 21st century. And so Lula must take dramatic, high-profile, public, meaningful, credible steps to combat corruption. The PT has not yet done a serious autocrítica for its for the last decade. It needs to do that, and it needs to. I am not an expert on this. But it must find a way to convince Brazilians that the government is seriously addressing corruption.
Natalia, very briefly, there is no shortcut to democracy. There is no ballot that will assure democracy, and that's it. I think that is very clear from our history, not only in Bolsonaro's term, but along our difficult and I would say complex history. I would point to 4 or 3 elements that could make a change. Education and diversity, precisely going back to the vulnerable candidates, why they are vulnerable and how people can be identified with them, especially because many of them come from communities that basically sometimes are not even voting for them. So yes, education and diversity, that is one of the points. Inequality, I mean, if we don't tackle that, forget about consolidating democracy. Inequality will have to be dealt, yes or yes. And thirdly, the institutions, and I include in the institutions the element of corruption as well. So with these 3 elements, we can perhaps think in having a democratic Brazil. Otherwise, we will face again, at some point in time, someone that will say, well, Bolsonaro's government was not that bad. And then obviously we know what history has taught us. Thank you once again.
So I'll close this event first of all, thanking everybody for these thoughtful presentations. I especially liked the fact that all of you seem to share with me the perception that we are in a very dangerous situation in Brazil. If we depend on a landslide victory to be in peace with democracy, we might be in real trouble, right? And it's really fortunate that this conversation went this way, because I see very little public awareness and public discourse in Brazil pointing to the threat to democracy that this process inherently carries, given the situation we are in. There were several questions in the Q&A about social media and its problems in Brazilian election. So I want to invite everybody again to the next event in the same partnership between DRCLAS and Agência Pública, which is going to happen on April 13th. It's called The Battle Against Fake News in Brazil's 2022 elections. So we didn't ask these questions, but they are here. You can come again on April 13th, and then we will be focusing on a specific question of social media. So thank you all. This was a wonderful conversation. We will continue. Bye-bye.